Hello everyone, this is Justin, and today I am just back from a trip from Killarney and thought I would shoot, let's not call it a review, but a little tour of this somewhat unique but very flawed tent, which is the Sierra Designs High Side 2. It's not available for purchase anymore. Sierra Designs appears to have discontinued it and is only selling the one-person version, but I thought it might be interesting to go over some of the design quirks and features of this tent because it's just so weird. So this is a two-person tent, and it is a tunnel-style tent. So we have a hoop at the front for a pole and another one at the rear here. And it is a two-door shelter made of sil nylon. The packaged weight with everything, excluding the footprint, so the tent body, the fly, all the pegs, and then the bags over here, the burrito bag, and a combined tent pole and peg bag, along with a couple of guy lines in there, comes in on my scales at 3 pounds 5 ounces, which is exactly what Sierra Design says it should weigh. And you can allegedly get under 3 pounds by leaving some of the stakes in the bags, but that is not actually feasible, which is what we'll look at in terms of one of the flaws of this tent. So having a look at it, the first thing you can probably see is that it is an absolutely massive footprint. So this is a backpacking tent. It's small and light, but the two doors are located on either side here. And what that leaves you with is a pretty wide tent, which is beneficial from the perspective of vestibule space. But if you're trying to pitch this in a fairly tight environment, you're going to have to cover quite a bit of area here. And looking at the tent itself, this does produce a pretty nice amount of vestibule space. So if we go over here and open up the front door, you can have a look inside here. There's a massive amount of vestibule space. We'll get a better shot from the inside. But for two people, you could likely fit all of your gear under one of the vestibules. They're just so huge. Now, the other quirk of the whole vestibule system relates to the name of this tent, which is the High Side. And the reason it's called the High Side is not because the fly is annoying. There we go. It's because we have an asymmetrical pole structure. So there's a pretty aggressive bend, a pre-bend in the pole here that gives this side of the tent, this door, a much more vertical orientation than this side over here. And it's a little bit hard to see on the video, but you can see how we're kind of sloping down here. And what this means is that this side of the tent is lower than that side of the tent. So there's a little bit less headroom on this side. And if we open up both sides of this tent, or both sides of this door rather, then what we'll see is that there's a fair amount of, there we go, toss it over there. There's a fair amount of the living area that's actually exposed on this side because it's not quite as sharp an angle on the door. So if you're opening from this side, you are exposing the living area to anything coming from the sky, any rain or anything, which is rather annoying. And probably the more annoying thing will be if you do have anyone staying with you while you're using this tent, someone does have to sleep on the low side. Now for myself, I usually go camping with my wife if it is two people, and my wife is significantly shorter than me, so the two-person setup is really not that bad. However, if you're going with a person who's the same height as you, then that gets a little bit more annoying. Now, one of the other quirks of this tent has to do with the geometry, this tunnel tent pole structure. And you can see here, when you're staking this thing out, you have two poles, or two pegs at the front that attach to the tent body and to the fly. The fly gets attached to the tent body with these clips. You have these two pegs that hold each of the vestibule doors on either side, so front zipper, back zipper. And then you have another two pegs at the back for the tent body. And again, it attaches the fly here with these two clips. Now this provides pretty good tension across the side, this way, so kind of laterally on the tent. So it stretches out the body pretty well and you get a nice taut pitch. However, you don't really get much tension along the length of the tent. So you can see here, you get a fair bit of pole movement. I have a little bit of wind here now, and you'll get a good bit of flapping. But the more serious problem with this is that you have this really massive unsupported section of fabric that isn't being tensioned very well. And you can tell that Sierra Designs saw the problem with this design because they put on these guy line attachments on both the front and the back of the tent. And these correspond internally to two little Velcro loops that go over the two poles. So you can guide these out with two additional stakes on the front and two additional stakes on the rear. And that will provide some additional tension along the tent this way. And that really helps to reduce the flapping of this fly here and also give you more internal room. We'll get inside the tent in a minute and we'll see kind of what this looks like from the inside when the internal or the external guy lines are not deployed. The other little quirk out here that we'll look at quickly is just on this side of the tent, which is the head end. We can see we do have another guy line at the foot here, or at the head of the tent, right at the bottom, that can pull the fly away from the tent body. And from both a rain and ventilation perspective, this is pretty important because you can see, really no matter how I pitch this, you end up with the fly touching the tent body here, and it's pretty taut all the way up through the very high bathtub floor. And again, Sierra Designs, it kind of comes up all the way to here where my hand is. So you can tell that Sierra Designs knew this was a bit of an issue. That's why they built the bathtub floor so high on the head end of the tent. But my recommendation, and from my experience when pitching this, is you do want to put a peg here as well to pull this part of the fly away from where you're breathing and where rain may be running down and potentially getting into the tent, or condensation rolling down from the inside and getting into the bathtub floor instead of rolling out of the tent and getting on the outside. So if you want to do a count on that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pegs for the basic setup, but really to get a nice taut pitch and avoid flapping and potential condensation or water issues, you want to add the two back guy lines and the two front guy lines plus this guy line here. So that is 13 stakes to actually put this tent up, and that takes some time. It adds a bunch of weight and is pretty annoying to do if you're trying to set this thing up in a hurry or take it down in a hurry. You know, there are tents like the X-Mid that you can set up with 4 pegs or 4 stakes for a minimum pitch. That will probably be just as stormworthy. So 13 pegs to get this thing standing, secure, and stormworthy, and just breathing properly is pretty excessive. The tent does come included with some ventilation flaps with little kickstands, which is a nice feature of the tent. You can see one at each side on the head end, and then a very large one at the foot end here. And generally these work fine, especially if you keep one of the doors open, either fully or partially open. Then it deals with condensation pretty well. I have seen a bunch of reviews saying this tent has condensation problems. I don't think so long as you keep those vents open and you make sure that your head end of the fly is pegged out properly to give some space between the tent body and the fly. Now let's go ahead and look inside this tent, and we'll have a little view of living space. And one kind of thing I'll note before we get inside is that you can roll this fly up the doors in two sections. So you can roll up to this middle tie-off point here, or if you unzip the back, you can roll up all the way to that point and have an entire side of the tent open. And that's pretty nice for ventilation on warm nights. Go ahead and find the door here. All right, we'll climb inside the tent here. So first of all, what you can see is lots and lots of room. My head is at the front of the tent here, and you can see I've got loads of room at my feet. No chance of my feet touching the mesh unless I'm doing some kicking. And you can see the absolutely massive vestibules in here. Loads of room on the low side of the tent here for your gear. And a couple of pockets. And some areas for hanging line or lantern and so on. And tie-offs for the two doors. Now, the one interesting thing that we see here, though, is that this mesh is quite loose. And if you look at pictures from reviews or other videos of people using this tent, what you'll see is that this area of the mesh is often quite loose and really starts hanging into your living space. And there you can kind of see it there. And this is a function of those external guy lines not being deployed in this tent. So if you really do want the headroom that you appear to have in this tent from the outside, then you need to have those external guy lines deployed. The other kind of quirky feature for this tent is those massive vestibules. So you can see, once I get into this tent, I only really have to use the front zipper to get in. But once I'm inside, it is a long ways out to actually zip up. I'm gonna have to change hands here to actually zip up this fly. So there we go, and you probably want to get the Velcro, so you got to kind of reach out here. So being able to do kind of a one-hand open of the door with this fly, even from one side, is quite the reach. And the other kind of issue here is that because this is a fairly low tent, which is great for shedding wind, and you also have a fairly low vestibule here, even if with this thing pitched fairly taut, it's not too high, and I probably wouldn't be comfortable using this vestibule area while the door is closed for cooking anything. So it's kind of storage only, and I'll go and show one other interesting feature of this tent that we can talk about that might mitigate that. But it is worth noting that with the door closed, you probably wouldn't want to cook here. I'd be worried about burning the tent. One final interesting thing to note about this tent is just the peak height. So we're looking at the peak of the tent here. There's the pole, there's the peak. Now we have a peak internal height of 38 inches here, which is pretty low. But you also have to consider that that peak height is before, I'm just going to get out of the tent here. That peak height is before you add in your sleeping bag and your sleeping pad. So if I'm out here kind of looking at this tent, you know, I'm going to have my sleeping pad here, I'm going to have my sleeping bag, and so if your head is hitting the top of this tent before you put anything into it, as mine is, then your head is definitely going to be hitting the top of that tent after you filled it with the things you would normally have in a tent. Now the final little quirk to look at with this tent is the porching feature. So I unfortunately don't have my trekking pole here, but if you want to, you have a little loop right on the door here that you can use to attach a trekking pole and then a guy line and guy out. So you have a little little porch. And you can see here, if you do that, then you have plenty of room for cooking safely because your fly has been extended away from the ground. And you can also see, hopefully, that you have enough coverage, at least on the high side, that you're not going to get rain coming into the tent unless it's being driven by wind in some way. So that is pretty nice. The thing I don't like about this feature is, unlike on Sierra Design's High Route, there's no clip on either side of this tent to take pressure off of the zippers. And you can even see with this tent just set up as is, with pretty loose tensioning on the stakes here, you're putting a lot of tension on the zippers. And especially so if you've come over here and you're trying to get this pretty taut by, guying out a trekking pole or a stick or something to pull this out, you're putting a lot of tension on the zipper. And that's even true just when this thing is closed. You'll see there's quite a bit of tension. We'll go around to the other side and have a look. There'll be quite a bit of tension on the zipper here as you're opening and closing. So I would suspect that the longevity of this tent is not going to be great, because the first thing that is going to fail is almost certainly going to be one of the door zippers, since they're pretty much always under tension. And if you want to use some of the cooler features of this tent, you're going to be putting them under even more tension. So I think that's pretty much everything I have to say about this tent. It's quirky, it's interesting, it has a lot of flawed design ideas that could probably be taken into other tents, but it makes perfect sense why they discontinued it, because it really doesn't have any real place or have any ideal positioning in the market. There are lighter tents, there are tents with more space, there are tents that are more compact, and most of those tents are probably cheaper than this thing, which came in pretty expensive. I think it MSRP'd for $359.99 US. So I have to give credit to Sierra Designs for producing something this weird and actually bringing it to market. And I hope to see some of the neat ideas in other tents, but overall I would say if you do find this thing on the market and go, well, that's kind of cool, I wonder how well it works, I would go ahead and say pick something else, unless you want to have a funky kind of weird tent to produce bad YouTube videos about.